Out of the funeral home before the ink was dry on the papers. Not because I was upset, not because I needed air. I walked out because my brother had just laughed at me in front of everyone, and I knew that if I stayed one more minute, I would say something I couldn't take back. So I left. I took the envelope my father's attorney had handed me, folded it once without opening it, slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket, and walked straight out the front door into the January cold. There was an older man sitting on the steps outside. He had a paper cup of coffee. He looked up at me the way people do when they can tell something just happened to you. I sat down next to him. I don't know why. I just did. We didn't talk for a while. Then he said, "Rough in there." I said, "Family stuff." He nodded like that explained everything. Because it does. I want to tell you how I got to that moment. Because it didn't start at the funeral home. It started about 40 years earlier in a house in central Ohio, with a man who loved both his sons but never quite figured out how to say so out loud. My name is not important. What's important is that I was the second son, the younger one, the one who stayed. My brother. I'll call him my brother because that's what he was, legally and by blood. He was 7 years older than me. He left Ohio the day after he turned 18 and didn't look back. Went to Phoenix, built something there, a business, a life. A version of himself that had very little to do with where he came from. And that was fine. I never held it against him. Some people need to leave a place to become who they are. I stayed. Married a woman from 2 towns over. Worked at the same manufacturing plant my father had worked at. Different department, same parking lot. We raised 2 kids in a house 12 minutes from where I grew up. When my parents got older and my mother's health started to go, I was the one who drove her to appointments. I was the one who sat in waiting rooms reading magazines from 3 months ago. I was the one who called my father every Sunday evening, not because I had to, but because if I didn't call him, he wouldn't call me, and I didn't want him to be alone on Sunday evenings. My brother called on holidays, sometimes. I'm not saying this to make him look bad. I'm saying it because it's true, and because it matters to what happened later. My father was a quiet man, proud in the way men of his generation were proud. He didn't complain, he didn't explain, he didn't talk about money or feelings or regrets. He grew up in a small town in Appalachian, Ohio, the son of a coal worker, and he spent his whole life being grateful that he'd done better than that, even if better meant a 2-bedroom house and a pension you had to fight the company to keep. When my mother passed 8 years ago now, something went out of him. He was still there. He still watched the news and mowed the lawn and made his coffee too strong every morning. But he was quieter than before, if that was even possible. He moved slowly through the rooms of that house, like he was trying not to disturb something. I checked on him twice a week. My wife came with me on Sundays. She'd make a real meal, and the 3 of us would eat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten every dinner of my childhood. And my father would eat everything on his plate and say, "That was good," and that was his version of thank you. My brother visited once a year, sometimes twice, if there was a holiday that coincided with a flight deal. He had money by then. Real money, the kind that makes a person slightly louder in rooms. He'd arrive with gifts, wine, good stories about places he'd been. My father lit up around him in a way that used to sting when I was younger. By 60, I'd made a kind of peace with it. My brother was exciting. I was reliable. Both things can be true. Last spring, my father had a stroke. He recovered partially, enough to come home from the rehab facility, enough to recognize faces and carry on a short conversation. But he wasn't himself anymore, not really, and we all knew it. The house felt different when I visited. He'd gotten small somehow, not physically. He was still tall, still had his posture, but small in the way that happens when a person knows they're near the end and has stopped pretending otherwise. He passed in November, quietly in his own bed, the way he would have wanted. My brother flew in for the service. He was good at funerals, I'll say that. He knew what to say to people. He shook hands. He told a story about my father at the reception that made people laugh in that good, relieved way. I was glad he was there. I want to be clear about that. Whatever came later, I was genuinely glad my brother was there. The attorney's office scheduled the will reading for the following Wednesday. I had never seen my father's will. He wasn't the kind of man who discussed that sort of thing in advance. He'd mentioned once, about 5 years back, that he'd taken care of things, and I'd taken that to mean he had a will, and it was handled, and I didn't need to know the details until I needed to know the details. That was how he operated. My brother and I arrived separately. He was already in the waiting room when I got there, scrolling his phone, wearing a good coat. He hugged me. We made the small talk that people make in attorneys' offices when someone has died. The attorney, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, was direct and businesslike in the way I appreciated. She read through the formalities. There were bequests to a local church, to a historical society my father had quietly supported for years, small amounts to a couple of cousins. Then she got to the main distribution. My father had divided his estate between my brother and me. That was expected. What was not expected, what I had not known, what apparently my brother had not known either, was how. My brother received the house, my father's house, the house we grew up in. He received the property, the contents, and a savings account that held a significant amount of money. The result of decades of careful, quiet living by a man who never spent more than he needed to. I received a sealed envelope. That was it. I looked at the attorney. She looked back at me with an expression that gave away nothing. My brother looked at the envelope in my hands. Then he looked at me, and I want you to understand, this was not a small laugh, not a nervous laugh, it was a real laugh. The kind that escapes before a person can stop it. He laughed. He said, "Dad gave you a letter?" He wasn't being cruel, I don't think. Not intentionally, but there were 4 other people in that room. The attorney, her assistant, my brother's wife, my wife, and he had laughed, and the words had landed exactly how they sounded. My wife put her hand on my arm. I looked down at the envelope. My name was on it in my father's handwriting, his real handwriting, not the shaky version from the last year, but the careful print he used for important things. He had written it before the stroke. I put it in my jacket pocket. My brother recovered quickly. He said something like, "I'm sure it's something meaningful," which was somehow worse. His wife touched his arm. The attorney moved on to the remaining items. I didn't open the envelope in that room. I said the right things to the right people. I thanked the attorney. I stood in the parking lot with my brother for a few minutes, and we said the things brothers say after their father's will has been read. He mentioned that we'd need to talk about the house. There were some personal items I might want, things that had belonged to our mother. I said yes, of course, we'd figure it out. He flew back to Phoenix the next morning. My wife didn't ask me about the envelope on the drive home. That's one of the things I love about her. She knew I needed to do it in my own time. I sat with it for 2 days, not because I was afraid of what was inside. I sat with it because it was the last thing my father would ever say to me, and I wasn't ready for it to be over. I opened it on a Friday morning. My wife had gone to run errands. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I opened it. There were 3 things inside. The first was a letter, 4 pages, handwritten on the lined paper my father always used for anything he wrote by hand. His handwriting was steady. He had written it 2 years before his stroke. The second was a smaller sealed envelope with a woman's name on it, a name I didn't recognize. The third was a key, a small key, the kind that opens a safe deposit box, with a paper tag attached. On the tag, in my father's print, was the name of a bank branch in Columbus and a box number. I read the letter first. I'm not going to tell you everything it said. Some of it is mine and I'm keeping it. But I'll tell you what mattered. My father had a daughter. Not with my mother. Before my mother, he was 19 years old, living in Columbus, and he'd been with a woman he loved but wasn't ready to be with. Not the way she needed. And she had gotten pregnant, and he had not handled it the way he should have. She had moved away. He had lost track of her. He had spent the next decade telling himself it had probably worked out, that the child had probably been adopted into a good home, that there was nothing he could do about it now. Then, when I was about 12 years old, he had found her, the daughter. She was 9, living with a family in Indiana. Her name was on the smaller envelope. Her adoptive family had been good to her. The woman he had loved had died when the daughter was 3, and she had gone into the system and eventually been placed with a family that kept her. My father had watched from a distance. That's the only way I can describe it. He had hired an attorney, not the one who read the will, an older one, long retired now, and set up a trust. For 20 years, quietly, from the same wages that built his savings, he had contributed to that trust. He had never made contact. He had never told my mother. He had never told me or my brother. He had done the only thing he felt he could do, which was to make sure that when the time came, there would be something there. The trust was in that safe deposit box, the paperwork, the history, the instructions for how to make contact. He left it to me because he trusted me to handle it right, not because he loved me more. He was very clear about that in the letter, and I believed him. He left it to my brother what he knew my brother would value, the house, the tangible things, the money he could understand. He left it to me because he knew me, because he knew I would sit with it, because he knew I would not make it into something that served me. He wrote, "I don't know if she'll want to be found. I don't know if she's had a good life or a hard one. I don't know if telling her any of this does more harm than good. That's why I'm leaving it to you. You'll know what to do. You always have." I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. When my wife came home and found me still sitting there, she set down the groceries and sat across from me without a word. I handed her the letter. She read it. When she was done, she looked at me across the table the same way she's been looking at me for 38 years. But she's waiting to hear what I think before she tells me what she thinks. I said, "I need to go to Columbus." She said, "I know." I went to the bank on a Monday. I brought the key and my ID and the death certificate. The box was exactly what my father described, a manila envelope, thick, held together with a rubber band that had gone slightly brittle with age. Inside was a file that his original attorney had assembled. Photographs, a birth record, a letter that was meant for her, the daughter, written in my father's hand, the shaky version, probably in the last few months before the stroke. There was also the trust documentation. The total in the trust, as of the date my father last updated the paperwork, was a little over $90,000. I won't tell you how I found her. I'll tell you that it took about 3 weeks and involved a letter sent through an intermediary, and that I was prepared to be told she didn't want contact, and that I had decided that, if that was her answer, I would honor it completely. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Her name, her real name, the name her adoptive family gave her. I'll keep between us. She was 51 years old. She lived in Michigan. She was a nurse. She had grown up in the family in Indiana, and it had been, by her description, a decent wife, not a fairy tale, but decent. She had spent years trying to piece together her biological family. She had found the record of her birth mother. She had found a name, my father's name, but she had never been able to get further than that. We talked for almost 2 hours. I told her about him, the real version, the complicated version, the version where he was a good man who did a wrong thing, young, and spent the rest of his life trying to make right what he could make right. I didn't make him a saint. I didn't make him a villain. I told her about Sunday dinners and strong coffee, and the man who showed love by showing up, even when he didn't know what to say. She was quiet for a while after that. Then she said, "He sounds like someone I would have liked." I had to put the phone down for a second. I called my brother that evening. He was polite. He listened. He was quiet in a way that I recognized as the particular quiet of someone recalibrating. He said, "You're kidding me." I said, "You're kidding me." I said, "No." He said, "Did Mom know?" I said, "The letter doesn't say, but I don't think so." He was quiet again. Then he said, "He gave you a letter, and it was that." I said, "Yeah." He didn't laugh this time. He called me back 3 days later. He apologized for laughing at the will reading. Not a big speech, not a lot of explanation. Just, "I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry." I told him I knew he hadn't meant it. He said, "Still." I respected that. My father's house sold in March. My brother handled it, that was the agreement. And he was good about it, sent me a fair portion of what my father had kept in savings once the estate was settled. I didn't expect that. I told him he didn't have to. He said Dad would have wanted it split. I don't know if that's true, but I let it be true. The sister, our sister I suppose, though she and I are still figuring out what that means for two people who are strangers in their 50s, came to visit in April. She drove from Michigan. My wife made a real meal. We sat at the kitchen table and talked for most of an afternoon and into the evening. She brought a picture of herself at about age 7 that someone had taken at a county fair, and I looked at it for a long time, because the way she was squinting into the sun looked exactly like the way my father squinted into the sun. I didn't say that out loud, but I kept the thought. She asked me why I thought he never reached out himself. I told her honestly that I didn't know. I told her what he wrote, that he didn't know if contact would do more harm than good. She nodded slowly. She said she'd thought about that possibility herself, from her side of it, that sometimes the people who stay away are staying away for you, not for themselves. She said she'd spent a long time being angry about it, and had eventually put the anger somewhere. It didn't take up all the room. I thought about my father sitting in his house on Sunday evenings watching the news, drinking his too-strong coffee. I thought about the things people carry that nobody else can see. I told her that the trust, all of it, was hers. She tried to refuse. I told her there was no version of this where I took money my father had set aside for her. She argued with me for about 20 minutes in the polite, practical way of someone who has been self-sufficient their whole life and is uncomfortable accepting things. My wife finally said from across the table, "Honey, let him do this." She looked at my wife. My wife looked back. Something passed between them that I didn't entirely understand, but recognized as significant. She said, "Okay, I still have the letter, the 4 pages in my father's handwriting, the steady version, written before everything changed. I've read it many times now. Each time I find something I missed. A phrase, a turn of thought. Something that sounds so much like him that it catches me off guard." He was not a man who said much, but in 4 pages, at the end of his life, he said enough. My brother calls more often now. Not every week, but more than before. He asks about her sometimes. He hasn't met her yet, but I think he will. He needs a little longer to understand what it means that our father was a more complicated person than either of us knew. I understand that. It took me a while, too. On the last page of the letter, after everything else, my father wrote one line that I've thought about almost every day since. He wrote, "He never needed me to tell you you were loved." That's how I knew I could trust you with this. I didn't know what to do with that sentence for a long time. I think I do now. He wasn't saying I was his favorite. He wasn't tallying up who stayed and who left, who called on Sundays and who didn't. He was saying something simpler than that, and harder. He was saying that the love that doesn't need to be announced is the love that holds. The man outside the funeral home that day, I never saw him again. He finished his coffee, said good luck in there, and walked off down the block before I even went back inside. I don't know who he was. I don't know what his story was. But I thought about him, sitting on those steps in January, nodding like, family stuff explained everything, because it does. It always does. I've had a lot of time to think about that Wednesday morning in the attorney's office, about the way my brother laughed, about the way I folded that envelope and put it in my jacket without a word. People ask me sometimes, not often, but sometimes, whether I was angry, whether I resented him for it. And the honest answer is that I was, for a little while. Not a burning kind of angry, more like the dull ache you get when someone you love does something small and thoughtless and you realize, not for the first time, that they don't quite see you the way you see them. But here's what I've come to understand about that moment, and about most moments like it. The way a person reacts when they think they've won tells you everything. My brother laughed because he assumed the envelope was nothing. He assumed that because, in his framework, value meant property and money and things you could point to. He'd spent his whole life building that framework. It wasn't cruelty. It was just the limit of what he'd learned to see. And my father, quiet, complicated, careful man that he was, had understood that about both of us long before I did. He knew what my brother needed to feel secure. He knew what I was capable of carrying. He didn't divide his estate out of favoritism. He divided it out of knowledge. That's a different thing entirely, and it took me a while to stop being defensive long enough to see it. What I keep coming back to is this. I did nothing extraordinary. I showed up on Sundays. I sat in waiting rooms. I called when I said I would call. None of that felt like sacrifice at the time. It just felt like what you do when you love someone and they're getting older, and the days are numbered even if you're pretending they're not. I wasn't keeping score. I wasn't building toward anything. I was just present. And yet that presence, that ordinary, unglamorous, unannounced presence, was exactly what my father saw. It was what he trusted. It was what made him believe I could handle the most important thing he had left to give. There's something in that worth holding on to. Not as a strategy, not as a way to get something in return, but as a way of understanding what integrity actually looks like in a life. It doesn't look like grand gestures. It doesn't announce itself. It's just the accumulation of small, consistent choices made when nobody's watching and nothing's guaranteed. My father made a wrong choice when he was 19. He spent the rest of his life trying to make it right, in the only way he knew how. That's not weakness. That's the slow, unglamorous work of becoming a better person than you were. Most of us will have to do some version of that. Most of us will have something in our past we can't undo. Only account for. Only try to repair. Only carry forward with as much honesty as we can manage. His daughter drove from Michigan to sit at my kitchen table. My wife made a real meal. We talked for hours about a man neither of us had fully known. And somewhere in that conversation, something that had been broken for 50 years started, not to heal exactly, but to be acknowledged, to be held in the light instead of the dark. That's all any of us can do, really. We can't undo what's been done. We can only decide what we do with what we're handed, whether we open the envelope or we don't, whether we make the call or we don't, whether we sit with the hard thing long enough to understand what it's asking of us. My father trusted me with his. I hope I'm worthy of it.